Before we give it a name, let's locate it, not conceptually, not theoretically, not through the kind of explanation that produces understanding without producing experience. You have already felt in asking you to recognize it for what it actually was. Cast your mind back to a moment of genuine crisis. It's not a difficult day, not a stressful week. It's a moment when something fundamental collapsed, a relationship, an identity. It's a version of the future you had been quietly organizing your entire life around. A moment when the floor gave way, and the story you had been living inside suddenly, without warning, stopped being able to hold you. Now, inside that memory, notice something. There was the collapse, the feeling of it, the specific quality of devastation that belongs to that particular loss, and no other. The mind spinning, the body registering what the mind could not yet process, the whole system moving through something it did not have a mapped for, and there was something else. Something that was present for all of it without being destroyed by any of it. Something that watched the collapse the way a very still body of water watches a storm move across its surface, registering everything, disturbed at the surface perhaps, but not, at its depth, moved. You know what I am describing. You have felt it. That is the watcher. In academic psychology it is called the observing self. A term precise enough to be useful and flat enough to miss almost everything important about what it actually is. The observing self is the metacognitive capacity to witness one's own mental experience, to step back, even momentarily, from the stream of thought and emotion and perception, and occupy a position from which that stream can be seen rather than simply inhabited. It is not a special state. It is not something you have to cultivate or earn or achieve through years of meditative practice. It is a structural feature of human consciousness, present in virtually every person, operating in the background of virtually every experience, surfacing most visibly in precisely the moments when the rest of the system is under enough pressure that the usual occupation of attention becomes briefly impossible. This is why crisis so often cracks people open. Not because suffering is instructive in itself, it is not automatically, but because the complete collapse of the familiar narrative structure creates, for the first time in perhaps a very long time, a gap, a silence where the story used to be. And in that silence, the thing that was always behind the story becomes briefly, startlingly visible. The mystic calls this grace. A psychologist calls it ego disruption. The neuroscientist points to decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain's narrative generation system, and notes that when the self-referential story quiets, something else becomes perceptible. They are all pointing at the same thing. The experiencing self and the observing self are not two different people living inside you. They are two different modes of being the same person, two different relationships to the contents of your own consciousness. The experiencing self is immersed. It is inside the feeling, inside the thought, inside the story. It has a temperature, has a texture, it is fully inhabited and fully believable to the one who is living it. The experiencing self is where joy lives, where grief lives, where love and rage and longing and shame all have their full weight and their full dimensionality. It is not a lesser mode. It is not a psychological problem to be solved. It is the mode in which you are most fully in contact with being alive. But it is also the mode in which you are most completely at the mercy of whatever is moving through you. Because from inside experience, experience is everything. From inside of fear, the fear is real and total and the whole horizon. From inside a story about who you are, the story is not a story, it is a fact. From inside a pattern, the pattern is not a pattern, it is the only logical response to circumstances that are genuinely as they appear. The observing self does not live inside any of this, it lives behind it, not above it. That word carries a suggestion of hierarchy, of superiority, of the observer looking down at the experiencer with something like condescension. That is not the relationship. The watcher does not evaluate what it watches, a Trowoodstar. It does not prefer one experience to another, not judge the fear as weakness, or the grief as indulgence, or the rage as evidence of something broken. It simply perceives, with a quality of attention that is, at its root, something very close to unconditional. This is why people who briefly contact the observing self in moments of deep crisis often describe the experience, not as detachment, but as the opposite, as a quality of presence, so complete, so unhurried, so entirely without agenda, that it feels almost like being held, not rescued, not fixed, held. There is a reason the witnessing function is so consistent across cultures, across centuries, across the full spectrum of psychological and spiritual traditions that have tried to name and map it. The Zen tradition's pure awareness, the Taoistic concept of the Sakshi, the silent witness, the Stoics' inner citadel, the Jungian observing ego, the ACT therapist's self as context, the mindfulness researcher's metacognitive awareness. Different vocabularies, different frameworks, different levels of scientific precision and spiritual elaboration, all pointing at the same structural feature of consciousness, a part that watches without being watched, a knowing that knows itself, an awareness that is aware of awareness. The consistency is not coincidence, it is cartography. Generations of people, independently, navigating inward and finding the same landmark, because the landmark is real, because it is structural, because it is not produced by the framework you use to look for it, but simply revealed by the looking. Now, and this is where the territory becomes more precise, the witnessing function is not uniformly accessible. Most people contact it briefly, intermittently, almost accidentally. A moment of sudden clarity in the middle of an argument where they see, from just outside themselves, exactly what they are doing and why. Quality of stillness that descends unexpectedly in a moment of great beauty or great loss. The strange, sourceless calm that sometimes arrives in circumstances that should produce only panic. These moments are not random. They are not spiritual gifts distributed unevenly to the fortunate few. They are apertures, brief openings in the continuous narrative occupation of the mind, through which something that was always present becomes momentarily visible. The question is not how to manufacture these moments. The question is what is preventing them from being the default. And the answer to that question is something most people can sense even before they can articulate it, because they have felt, at some point in their lives, the specific quality of effort required to maintain a story that no longer fits. It's the energy expenditure of keeping a self-concept intact against the quiet pressure of evidence that contradicts it. The low-grade exhaustion of a mind that is simultaneously simulating a narrative and suppressing the awareness that the narrative is a narrative. Not because the watcher is fragile, it's because the story is loud. Here is something that almost no content in this space will say directly. The people who most strongly identify with being self-aware, who have done the most work, read the most books, spent the most hours in therapy or meditation or spiritual practice, are not always the people with the most access to the witnessing function. Sometimes they are the people who have built the most sophisticated story about their self-awareness. There is a version of psychological insight that is still entirely inside the experiencing self, that generates concepts and frameworks and narratives about consciousness without ever actually shifting into the observing position. It is self-awareness as content rather than self-awareness as location. The person knows a great deal about their patterns. They can describe their attachment style, their shadow material, their childhood wounds, their cognitive distortions, with impressive precision and genuine hard-won understanding flew, and they are still, in the most fundamental sense, inside it, still narrating rather than witnessing, still having the insight as an experience rather than observing the experience from behind it. This distinction is not a criticism. It is the most important distinction in this entire audiobook, because it is the difference between transformation that is known about, held as belief, as identity, as the story of someone who has done their work, and transformation that is lived, inhabited, embodied in a way that does not require the narrative to maintain it. The watcher does not produce insights, it produces seeing, and seeing, real seeing, the kind that does not require interpretation or analysis, or the construction of meaning. It changes things not by adding something to what is already there, but by removing the one obstruction that was keeping the same awareness from reaching to what it was always pointed at. You, the whole of you, not the curated version. It's not the healed version or the broken version, or the version you present to the world, or the version you have decided to believe you are. It's all of it, watched with a quality of attention that has never, not once, required you to be different than you are. This is the thing about the watcher that is almost impossible to communicate through language, which is, of course, the only instrument currently available to us. It does not want anything from you, not growth, not healing, not spiritual development or psychological integration or any of the outcomes that the conscious self is almost constantly in the business of pursuing. It is not invested in your becoming anything other than what you already are. It is not disappointed when you fall back into pattern. It is not relieved when you manage to hold the line. It is not keeping score. It is simply present, and that quality of presence, unconditional, agenda-free, timelessly patient, is something the experiencing self, the performing self, the self that has been working so hard for so long to be something other than what it fears it is, has been starving for. Possibly for years, without quite knowing what it was hungry for. The watcher is not a resource. It is not a tool. It is the part of you that has been offering, quietly and without announcement, the one thing you have been searching for everywhere else, to be seen completely, and found, not wanting. You were never lost. You were simply facing the wrong direction.